Hey everybody, this is Emmy Thomas. I'm here with Serena Martini. I'm going to ask her the same question I always ask, which is what is it like to be you, Serena Martini?
Hi, Emmy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to get to chat with you. I am not that interesting. I would love to hear a lot about you, but I guess if you're really interested, some things about me are I am both blissfully and painfully introspective, um, hyperactive, both in thought and behavior. Um, my thoughts never really turn off. I'm always in motion physically. I'm obsessed with people, with the science of people, and with the different sciences and philosophies of the universe. So I can share with, I know you know, I'll share with whoever feels like tuning in right now. I'm a sixth year PhD student in clinical neuropsychology, so kind of speaks to that obsessive interest in learning more about the science of people. I've also been identified by others in my field as a highly sensitive person, like the HSP thing, and a radical empath, which are not terms that I typically use to describe myself, but some people do. Um, I'll never ever claim to be perfect at this or that I'm like the expert on anyone else, but I have sort of come to understand this sort of like seventh sense that I have for kind of like feeling what others are feeling. Definitely impacted by Zoom, doesn't go this quite the same way. And I also am really verbose. I'm hyperactive. I talk way too much. I think way too much and I never shut up. Somehow I'm still, I think, a good listener. And I guess the last thing is I'm intensely logical and emotional, an artist and a scientist, a listener and a speaker, a follower and a leader. One of my best friends one time called me the dumbest smart person she knows. And overall, I think I like to focus on moderation and balance. Um, and my nose runs constantly.
Okay, sounds good. It's funny you say a leader and a follower. I have always felt like this, and I just watched the season finale of Yellow Jackets. Do you know this TV show, Yellow Jackets?
No, I thought I saw it come up on a social media post about cannibalism the other day, though.
Yeah.
I don't know anything. I have not heard about it otherwise.
Yeah, I hope this is I don't think it's a spoiler. It's just basically the structure of the plot is and it all happens in the pilot is that this girls soccer team gets in a plane crash and then they have to survive in the Canadian wilderness, right? So they're it's really interesting because they're teenage girls. They're like high school girls or something. So everything about the psychology of teenage girls, but also this idea of like who's going to lead and who's going to follow is really interesting because I feel like and I think about like my girlfriend too who is also kind of like uh let's say psychopath or psychopath adjacent. And she has kind of in not in all contexts or whatever, but she's kind of like admitted to me recently that she's a secret submissive, a secret sub, about things where she kind of like secretly likes to just follow, likes to just kind of have somebody who knows what they're doing and
Sure.
then just be like a passenger for whatever is happening. I feel the same too. Like if I could just trust the people around me and maybe it's this like lifelong distrust of my primary parental figures or whatever that has like led me to, like be kind of like a control freak about things. But I actually do like to like cede control. It's such a relief because it's such a burden to be in control. Have you ever seen the movie Holly Hunter's in it? I think it's called Broadcast News.
I
It's super
haven't seen
old.
most of the movies, but I'm totally interested. Tell me.
Yeah, it's from the 80s or the early 90s. And she plays like this news anchor, super kind of, I guess, type A personality and really passionate about the news, really passionate about issues and stuff. And she's talking to, she's like, yeah, we're doing the coverage of whatever Libya wrong or something. And then she's talking to kind of one of the producers, and he kind of is like put off by what he considers to be like self-righteousness about kind of the ethical whatever of things. And so he says to her something like, it must be nice to be right all the time, where he's being sarcastic. Even I picked up on that. He's being sarcastic. And she says, no, actually it's not. It's not nice to be right all the time. I feel that way kind of with this, like, both leader and a follower. I like to be a follower sometimes. It's not nice to be kind of the one who, like, predicts bad things. Like, I don't have any current bad predictions, but sometimes I felt like I'm like a Cassandra about things. You know, this Cassandra myth or whatever. She, like, sees
Yeah.
kind of the future and, tries to tell people, tries to warn them, and then they think she's crazy or whatever, and so she's cursed with the knowledge of what's gonna happen, and nobody believes her. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get it. No, I think there's great comfort in following, right? And ultimately I think it's the thing that the best leaders can do is learning how and when is appropriate to follow. I think the best leaders out there, like world leaders, are the ones who understand how to listen and be part of a group, be part of a team. So that's kind of how I approach that line. But I also kind of identify what you're saying with this like closet submissive. Like, yeah, I very much identify as kind of like an alpha personality, but like my partner is also such a strong alpha, and I love when he's able to take over things and do and be, and I can just kind of follow along and like turn my brain off for a while. It's really a different feeling that is very comforting, because at the end of it, like, I'm lazy and I want to lie around and have someone take care of me all day.
Yeah.
You
If
know?
somebody else can just figure something out, people are afraid of, like, AI or whatever. I'm like, if AI can figure out something that I don't have to figure out, great, I can focus on different things.
Are you wholly not unafraid of AI?
Not wholly, but I'm a very, I guess I've been thinking about this recently. Like, do I even remember what I was worried about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago? Have any of those fears played out? The only ones I can kind of think that have played out, like, there's a little bit of my legal scholarship that has stayed true. So kudos to me for correctly predicting things in my legal scholarship. But outside of professional, like, I guess I kind of sense that in like 2006 to 2010, we were kind of living in the golden age of internet, what I would say, where everything was still just good.
Mhm.
Everything, every new change was like a good change or something. And I kind of thought, yeah, this is probably a
Before you
golden age. We'll think back on this and think, hey, golden age. But I don't have any current worries about AI other than like the Terminator ones, and I'm kind of glad that the Terminator ones have happened. I guess the if I had a concern about AI, so this is psychopath related. People will be glad to hear this after we've been chatting about just random things. Is that I asked ChatGPT 4, I think, or my friend did who has a subscription, what are some of the good things about a psychopath? And it spent like a whole paragraph being like, well, nobody should aspire to be a psychopath, and psychopaths do all these bad things, and et cetera, et cetera. Like, good is not a good word to use for psychopath. But then it was like, with all that in mind, with all those caveats, here are the five strengths or whatever of a psychopath. And then it had like a final paragraph where it was like, let me reiterate though, that there's like, like psychopaths are terrible and, like borderline evil. And, thank you for your time, whatever. So I thought that was interesting because it's just collecting the knowledge that's out there, right? It's just like combing the internet, combing other people's ideas. So in a way, it's kind of like a summary of it, but kind of like with a woke spin, right? Because they're definitely trying to ethically influence it, right? And so I just thought it was like an interesting way in which it manifests. I'm sure they didn't program it specifically to talk about psychopaths, but that's just how that's how like the ethics manifested in itself, the its programmed ethics. With combined with, like, the kind of prevailing, I guess, wisdom about what, whether or not psychopaths have strengths. So I thought it was an interesting response. I guess that kind of worries me a little bit, is that somebody's going to read that and read into it. But I think there's plenty of transparency about like what it can and can't do. And that as long as you understand, kind of, this from research, garbage in, garbage out research, that like whatever flaws there are in the data are going to not disappear in the analysis of the data. Like you can do things to kind of work with it. But if you understand this is the process, and, uh, that it's just kind of collecting the collective wisdom of humanity, and whatever we don't know, it doesn't know, kind of, et cetera, et cetera, then I think it's fine. So I don't have too many concerns now.
Love it. What did you think and or feel about ChatGPT saying that someone should not strive to be a psychopath?
I have said this before too, in a couple different ways. I love this question actually. Like I've said before, and I do think it's true, that we shouldn't try to create more psychopaths. That I think to the extent that psychopaths kind of pop up, they're responding, like the particular mix of everything that like makes a person, right? So their environmental, their genetics, their whatever else you want to kind of include in this, they that that is kind of like a not an optimal response to their situation, but is like a response that is trying to be adaptive. Even if it ends up being maladaptive, it's trying to be adaptive to whatever situation that they're in. It's they're in wartime, civil war in Africa or whatever, and it doesn't really pay for them to be like, let's say, and I thought this was really interesting research, and I apologize I didn't even bother to look this up. It's interesting you say you're a hypersensitive person. Not I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but you said something about that, I should say.
Yeah,
And
highly sensitive person. It's not something that I know a lot of about in research, but
yeah.
I've kind of heard it in media. And when I looked it up, I was like, oh yeah, that kind of sounds like me.
Yeah, kind of like me with Psychopath. So, there was this one Israeli, study where they kind of thought that, like, the more sensitive you were, kind of the more likely you were to be triggered to being a psychopath. And that kind of makes sense to me in a way. I think that is kind of like maybe not what people think, but I'm not saying maybe all psychopaths that's what's happened, but I can kind of see like if you're like super sensitive, and then like the littlest thing can kind of jostle you, then it might be just enough to kind of disconnect. I think we're all familiar with like these boxes that like say fragile, handle with care, or don't turn upside down, or whatever. In a lot of ways, I think that kind of psychopaths, a lot of psychopaths at least, are a little like that. They're like fragile, handle with care. And then when they're not handled with care, then something like kind of jostles loose in them, like they don't end up kind of developing the way that they otherwise would, because they are so uh prone to being affected by external circumstances. I think that it's kind of an interesting idea, because I think even about like my girlfriend with this, like she's kind of a reluctant control freak, right? Because she really is this closet submissive. But then if everything's kind of going wrong around you, you don't have the luxury of being leaning that particular way. It'd be like you kind of mentioned that you feel like you're introverted, but if you didn't have the luxury of being introverted, you'd still
Not
kind of.
introverted. No,
Oh,
that
you're
one
not
I understand.
introverted? Ooh,
Introspective, I think.
introspective. Okay, okay, okay. So if
Definitely not introverted.
so this doesn't apply to you then. But if somebody was like highly introverted or something, like sometimes people say this, like, "Oh, you don't seem introverted to me," to somebody else, and I think, well, I mean, they may not have the luxury of kind of doing the thing that is their natural flow,
Mhm,
because their circumstances kind of don't provide an opportunity for it.
mhm. And at the end of the day, I think the people that we end up being most drawn to are those who we're allowed to be ourselves around, right? I feel like I hear that echoed so often. It's like, oh, I can
Yes.
actually like take off and be me when I'm with you, kind of feel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you then, do you identify as like I don't even mean to use labels, and please feel free to answer or not answer anything I ask you. Do you identify as like highly sensitive, or however that means to you, not as a label, but I think I actually have a question like noted out. I was planning on asking with regards to like gross sensation perception, sight, sound, touch, smell, taste. Have you noticed particular sensitivities or insensitivities in yourself, and or how these may compare to others you've met with psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder,
Yeah.
etc.?
So the one sensitivity, well, I've been thinking about this a little bit recently, because remind me to get back to this. I don't, because I already forgot your first question and I felt like I may or may not have answered it.
Well, so I think my question is, what sensitivities or insensitivities do you
Yeah.
tend to identify with? And let's start with like just basic sense, like five senses. And then I kind of want to get into more like higher level, like emotions, thoughts, kinds of things.
Yeah, and I'm gonna start at something adjacent in the answer that I've been a personal experience I've been struggling with recently is some sort of weird, mysterious bug infestation, and it's only in my room, and I sleep separately with my
Gosh.
girlfriend. So it's only in my room, and if I get the bug bite, then I can't see them. I don't know what's happening. People can put like in comments or whatever, like whatever they think it is, but the bug bites will last for kind of 2 weeks, and they're so bad. They're, like, worse than anything else that I've had, like mosquito bites, and she gets, like, maybe a bite for, like, a second, and then it disappears or whatever, and, like, I've showed them to, like, my family and friends and stuff, and, like,
Have you
for
shown
whatever
them to the
reason, my
doctor?
dad is most worried right now. He's like, "I'm really worried about these bugs," and, like, Emmy has always been sensitive to bugs and, like, all these things, and I'm like, "Wow, I'm actually a little surprised he noticed that about me or whatever, seems to care or whatever for some reason about this." But it is true. Like I've always like both attracted and been really sensitive to bug bites. And I actually have a friend, it's a similar thing. Like if we get a bee sting, the chances of getting cellulitis, like where it's like out of control infection, like really swollen, and you basically have to do antibiotics because your body is reacting in a weird way to it. The chances of getting cellulitis from a bee sting for us is like 80%. And every time, like, you go to the doctor and the doctor's like, wow, this must have just been a really dirty bee sting. And we're like, yeah, every single bee who stings us is just like dirty as all hell or whatever, right? Because that's their understanding is that the cellulitis comes from like, a dirty, like, whatever, like bacteria or something in the sting itself. And it's like, well, maybe, or maybe something else is kind of happening. So
So,
so I
yeah.
feel like, in a lot of ways, I kind of do understand, like, this idea of sensitivity because I am sensitive in, like, these, like, really weird ways. Like, I have, like a really bad immune system. Like I am sensitive and I feel so kind of like vulnerable to things constantly. So I do identify that way, but it's not necessarily because I'm like super self-aware emotionally. I'm not. Traditionally, I'm like not super self-aware, but am I super self-aware physically? No, again, I am not. So it's a hard question to ask me, but the other day I was doing something. There was like something kind of like a trash truck in the background or something. There was some noise or there was something where I had to just like endure the noise. Maybe it was at Disneyland and I like heard the like train of the roller coaster or whatever like pass by or something like in line. And I thought, okay, I just have to like endure this for this like
Mhm.
little moment. And I thought, yeah, this does really bother me. I am like bothered by sounds. I
Okay.
probably always have, but I'm a musician, so I wonder, have I been trained to be bothered by the sounds? Have I like but like I will wear earplugs like at the drop of a hat. Like I wear them on roller coasters frequently because the screaming, like if I'm on a plane, it's always noise cancellation headphones or it's
Mhm.
always earplugs. So that one, I don't think I'm sensitive to light. In fact, I love sunshine. I like go out in the morning for 10 minutes every morning at least to try to get direct sunlight.
What about like things that you just find to be personally, like, I guess personally averse, like everyone's sensitive to personal aversions, but I don't know, because I'm thinking about something like art that you don't like, or like the way your music sounds versus someone else. Do you think it's just kind of like a stimulus intensity thing, or does your preference for that kind of stimulus play into how sensitive or insensitive you are to the stimulus? Did that question make sense?
Yeah, it's not just like a decibel level because if something's kind of like out of tune in a bad way,
Yeah.
then yeah, I have this problem because I'm like religious, so I go to church, but not all church singing or whatever playing in church is good. So I often have to like put my head down.
Which is common with many musicians to cringe it out of, yeah,
Yeah.
do the same thing.
But it's weird because, like, my family has remarked about this too, and I don't know if it's like a brain thing or a sensitivity thing, but I love to put in like weird extended harmonies, or if people are like singing along, I will like add a harmony that's like a discordant harmony. Like it will
Mhm.
be like a weird, like a fourth above it, and just stay with the fourth the entire time, even when the notes go out of the scale or whatever. Like I
Tell
love to
me
do
more
stuff like
about
that.
that.
Yeah, my
What's
brain loves it.
Tell me
It's
more about
like
that. What's that feeling that you're like? What's enjoyable about that to you?
yeah, it feels like I'm kind of reordering things, like, because you're adding a harmony. Anyone can add, like, a harmony that sounds good. But to me, if you, like, add this harmony that's perfectly spatially, like, it's spatially perfect because it's, like, always the same interval up and down, and you don't adjust it at all. For the chord or for whatever, because notes in a melody, like, occupy different places in the chord, like, one's a third and one's, like, a fifth or whatever, so you can't ever do that, like, in kind of normal music and have it sound right, but there's something about kind of, like, playing with this concept, like, I it's not just the tickling of my brain, it's like I like to hear the unexpected sounds that it creates, I like to kinda just, like, stick to this process and then let the results fall out where they may kind of thing rather than be like my end goal is the outcome. I like to stick to the process and make even if it turns out like weird outcomes.
Is it kind of like the novelty of the outcome that feels?
No, I think it's the control that I feel like I am not bending even to the rules of music in this, like I'm not trying to like anybody else listening to this could be like, that sounds bad. And they always do laugh. And, like my mom, who's also a musician, she's like, you always do that.
Do you make music for you or for others?
For me. And I have like in my
Exclusively.
voice memos on my phone, like a bunch of weirdo songs, crazy, stupid songs that like they just get in my head. And it's just so nice to kind of just like give them voice or whatever. So I love to do that. I love to feel like something is like purely me. And
Mhm.
honestly, like this is me kind of like shrinking my own self. But I think it's because I feel like, I have kind of like a secret. I use um I used to think that my love language was touch. And then, like, after I got, like, plenty of touch, it turned into tasks or service or whatever. Like, I prefer, like, my loved ones to, like, give me service. And then I wondered, was I just, like, touch deficient? Was I just kind of, like, seeking out touch as a love language? And so I think this too with, like, something purely me. Like, am I just, like, so purely me deficient? Is there just so little in my life that feels like it's purely me and not being constantly, mediated by like external forces, or I'm not constantly trying to fit into things. And it's interesting because I had this experience recently. I was like gone for too long. It was too long of a vacation, and it was made worse because I went to a music festival the weekend right before I left. And so it felt like that was also part of it. So it felt like I was gone for 4 weeks. And then when I got back, I was just, like, so crazy and the bugs that were biting me. But I was like, I can't get, like, my mind right." And then this week, it's been in the 2nd week, I started to just be like, "No, I'm not going to reply to these emails. I'm not going to even return this phone call. I'm just gonna do the thing that I want to do." And for a couple days, I did that, and it was just, like, felt so much better. Like, it felt like everything finally, like, made sense again, and, like, I was back in not control of my life because, like, the illusion of control or whatever, but it just felt more like even when I did choose to do something like reply to an email, like it felt like a form of self-expression rather than something that was being externally imposed on me. And I feel like I really am sensitive to that. That's probably my biggest sensitivity. And it manifests itself like psychologically, emotionally, physically, with my senses, like sight, sound, whatever. Like if I feel like I'm choosing the thing, it's totally fine. If I feel like it's being imposed on me, I'm super disturbed by it.
I like that answer.
Mm,
Um, I was kind of it sort of leads me to think of something else I was interested in asking you about, which might feel unrelated, but I promise to me it's linked. I hope you see, see the link. I remember the last time we spoke, you mentioned that you sleep 10 hours a day. Do you still
mhm.
do that? Is that like an embedded?
Yes.
Yeah. How long have you been doing that for?
I've been doing that solidly since probably law school. And law school is like I've always played weird games with myself to try to optimize myself in weird ways, but like in stupid ways. Like in law school, one of the games I played with myself the first year was I'm going to try to budget only $2 a day for food. Only so $14 a week.
Why?
Because
Was
I
it
was
to
like,
challenge
just
yourself to
wanted the
be,
game. Yeah, I
yeah,
wanted something kind of like to force myself to be like, hey, how extreme can we take this? I've always loved to explore like the extremes of the things that I can kind of like put myself in such extreme situations. I don't know uh I don't know why that one, but so in law school too, I was like, well, I'm only here for 3 years and like the grades that I get here kind of determine my future trajectory so much that it kind of just makes sense to just like lock everything down,
yeah,
and so everything almost like have you ever like listened to like LeBron James talk about, I think he sleeps like 14 hours a day.
not surprising.
Yeah, or like Michael Phelps or something, they'll say all these like weird things that they do, things that normal people don't need to because it doesn't matter. Like that extra additional 1% performance doesn't matter, but these people do. So like during that first year of law school, I was like, let's see what like my optimum is. And I kind of thought, okay, like actually like my brain is able to do its best work after I've like slept 10 hours. And if I've slept under 10 hours, then it's almost as if, like, I might as well just wait until the next day to do the
How
thing.
did how did you measure that? Was it just kind of like based on your feeling and your productivity, or did you actually like track data on your behavior, your productivity, etc.?
So, I think I mean, it would be hard to measure it, right? But I would say and this is still true, where, like, I can just tell, like, a task that would take me, like, 3 hours on a bad day can take me, like, 30 minutes on a good day. And I do, like, a lot of things that are kind of repetitive, so and very kinda similar. So, let's take, for instance, like, registering a trademark. For one of my clients. That task could take sometimes it will take like 4 hours, like on a really bad brain day. And on a good brain day, it takes like just over an hour or something. And I like prioritize it in the day, like when I'm like ready and kind of like do the thing because I hate drudgery, mental drudgery, or any kind of drudgery, especially mental drudgery, I guess. And I hate to feel tired. That's another thing. Like, if I would rather be sick than be tired, like, I'd rather be nauseated, and, like, throwing up than be tired.
Why do
I
you
don't
feel
know
like you
why.
have less control when you're drowsy?
I feel like, and this is something too people often ask, like, "Oh, do you drink or something?" But the drinking kind of also has, like, a similar effect to being tired. It's like I'm not like, do you ever get the sensation, like, maybe as you're just, like, waking up or something that your body's not responding right away, like there's a lag? That's what it feels like. It feels like there's a lag in my brain, and it makes me feel super existential.
Meaning what?
Like, if there's a lag in my brain, have you ever done that, like, with your phone or something where it lags? And,
Mm.
like, before I got on with you, like, my Zoom crashed or whatever, and it was like I click things, and then it would, like, try to do the thing, and it's, like, so kind of, like destabilizing for me when that happens. I'm so frustrated. I'm like, click, 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 trying to get the thing to do it. Because there's like an illusion that our body gives us, or our brain gives us, I guess, that like we're controlling our body, we're controlling our thoughts to some degree. And that illusion feels like nice. I think that's why the brain gives us this illusion. And then when it gets
And
disrupted
also, because you just
somehow, like
mentioned
you're
that this is something that's particularly sensitive for you, that
what
feeling.
is?
That feeling of being in control of my environment and that I have cause over my effects, right? So I'm sure
Mhm.
that, I mean, I identify with that certainly when things don't work out. I think I'm also pretty sensitive to feeling of being out of control or something, but you did just mention that that's something that's hyper, like, you know.
Yes, physically, like brain. So I used to control, and this is like a good, I saw something, I like retweeted it like a few weeks ago. It was talking about like the personality disorders, like, and what are their biggest fears. And it said for psychopaths or antisocial personality disorder, I forget what word they use. They said that control, like being out of control or not in control or something, is a fear. And I do think that that is at least true for me. Like I can speak to my own experience and say that like, yeah, I used to be a control freak about everybody. Others, like controlling what I eat, just for kind of the fun, for the exercise of control probably is like where it was stemming from. And that was like a big thing that I had to kind of stop doing, because if you're controlling everybody, everything, you're like doing like heavy amounts of manipulation in every relationship that you're in, and people don't like that, is what I've learned.
So what?
So you have to stop manipulating. But how do you stop manipulating? This is a good question. Do you have an idea? Like not how you personally, but how would somebody, if a person wanted to stop manipulating, what is the kind of like the positive thing they would replace it with, because you can't just, it's like saying stop breathing or whatever. You have to replace it with something, or like stop
Yeah,
thinking.
everything needs to be replaced with something. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a pretty adamant believer in that, and that's something that I've been taught in school, like pretty religiously, is you don't just extinguish behavior, you replace it. And so I think that answer is pretty specific to most people. So I would probably ask them like, well, why do you want to stop? How much do you want to stop? What happened that made you say that you wanted to stop, that got you all the way from your house to come see me?
Mhm.
What's this thing that's really burning on your mind, and kind of get more of that information to learn, what is it that you previously were accessing or avoiding through manipulation. I'm just going to use your word, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Manipulating behavior. What were you accessing or avoiding by doing that? And how can we maybe meet the same goal in a way that you feel is healthy for you and also is healthy for the people that you're interacting with, vis-a-vis your goal to be healthy for you, right? It seems like health for you means you want a good relationship with this person. And I think starting with that motivation is always such a key piece to change.
So I
And
want to
so
get
that's sort of how I'd get the conversation going.
nice. I want to get like a little bit more uh superficial, I guess, and of an answer. Like if you're not manipulating, like let's say you have a choice, hey, like where should I suggest that we go to lunch today? That's your choice of action. Somebody's asking like, "Hey, where do you want to go to lunch?" And then how do you respond? There's like the manipulative response, right? But what's the non-manipulative response? What's the behavior that doesn't look like manipulation? How would you describe that?
Um, I mean, can I ask you how we're defining manipulation to begin with?
Yeah. So in this sense, manipulative means I am primarily, or at least kind of like, like a to a large extent or significantly is the lawyer word we would use, choosing in order, like the purpose of my choice is to influence another person, influence their behavior, influence how they feel, influence, like that's the choices. Like I'm other person focused. I'm focused on like the effect that the my choice will have on the other person, and I'm trying to like achieve a particular outcome in that other person.
So I'm thinking maybe the counter to that would be just like it's anti, right? So maybe my choice is free of bias, or reducing bias as much as possible. I'm going to answer as honestly as possible without perhaps considering how my choice is going to affect that person. I think that's sort of what I'm thinking of as the most opposite to the former that you just presented. What do you think?
Yes, I agree. I agree. You're and free of bias, and so you would be choosing from a place of where you're not
Minimizing
choosing.
bias as much as possible. Sure, it's always never possible to eliminate bias, but yeah.
Right. But like, if you're not kind of choosing to kind of like benefit or harm or whatever other people, then where are you choosing from? Where does that choice come from? If not to like make some difference in your external world.
Where does this question come from?
This question comes from because like this idea of control, like I realized kind of in I went to therapy. Like the reason why I went to therapy primarily was to stop manipulating people. But you can't just stop manipulating people because you still have to make the choice. So you have to replace it with something. Like what would I say? Like what would I say about where we should go to lunch if I'm not trying to like please my friend? Or to antagonize, my brother-in-law or to,
Yeah, I
whatever it
mean,
is.
I think part of that is kind of understanding how, perhaps for some people or for me, how can I view choice and manipulation as two separate entities that don't necessarily have to overlap, right? How can I have one without the other? Um, which is difficult, right? It takes work and examples. And again, I think going back to that motivation, like why am I asking this? What is my bias? What am I coming in with here? And kind of understanding as like on as neutral a field as possible. Okay, really, what is a choice?
Mhm.
How can I make a choice? Just plain and simple, how do I make choices? And if the
Yeah.
answer is perhaps like to manipulate people, then we say, okay, well, all right. I mean, lots of people do make choices in ways that don't necessarily consider what other people are.
But what do those choices look like? What are they based on if not manipulation?
It's different for everyone, I think.
Okay, just give me an example, just one example that somebody might base the choice on.
Can you give me a little more of an example of like what kind of choice we're talking about? Just because there's
Yes.
so many ways I could go with that.
Yeah, so like could be you, could be anybody that you know, but let's say somebody asks "Hey, where do you want to go to lunch today?" Like if they weren't choosing based on manipulating, what would they choose based on?
I mean, personally, I would choose based on like convenience, right?
Convenience to whom?
To both of us, I think. I think I usually try to meet in the middle. I view this very
But if you're
literally.
not trying to manipulate the person, like you're not trying to affect them in any sort of way, you're just like, I'm trying to like impact them. I'm not trying to choose at all based on how it's going to affect them. What would that
You
look
know,
like?
so maybe we can call it manipulation. I think that when I make decisions, and this is something that like I'm just going to be very personal about because again, there are so many reasons for why people decide things the way they do. I'm going to use the perspective that you know I have the greatest expertise on, which is very little at the end of the day, my own. No, when I make decisions about things, I think I tend to, without really thinking too much about it, I tend to kind of go like hierarchically, like I am 100% me. I come first. That's my priority, is what I want. And then very quickly after that are like the people that are closest to me: my mom, my dad, my brother, my boyfriend, my other family members. Their perspectives and their wants and their needs come like right after mine. And being in relationships with those people often means that I put myself first, and also often means, like a little less often, but often means that I put their wants and needs first. Right. And I think my decision making kind of follows that like evolutionary genetics kind of hierarchy, is like, well, first I go to me. And sometimes it means that I go to the next layer, which is someone else. But ultimately, it comes back to me because I've got to promote my survival. Right. And I've got to let my cat in a second. He's in and out all over the place. Um, but yeah, that's kind of how I tend to follow things. And then, it would be a friend after that. It would be an acquaintance after that. Maybe someone like, someone that's interviewing me. I'm going to make decisions via a very different algorithm or heuristic decision making process than someone whom I'm interviewing, right? There are so many kinds of relationships. And I think, you know, neuropsychologically, cognitively, that tends to be the decision making hierarchy that a lot of people fall on.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the healthiest choices do involve some degree of manipulation, right? And honestly, it happens in therapy all the time. If someone comes to me, they're my patient, and they say, I want to get better for X, Y, and Z reason, I am certainly not going to always say things that are coming out like direct or without secondary gain. I'm doing it to go back to their initial goal, but it still might be viewed as manipulative because it's not directly following in line with what they're presenting to me in the moment. Let me let my cat inside. He's going to keep meowing at the door. Just give me 1 sec.
No problem.
What do you think of that?
So I think that is totally true, and I kind of want to take you like a slightly different kind of thinking place. Like if you think about the extreme kind of people pleaser, what would an extreme people pleaser in your mind? Like a total extreme doesn't even exist, but like like take it to the limit, like in calculus or whatever. A people pleaser would do what? In terms of making a decision. A people pleaser, you ask a people pleaser, where do you want to go for lunch, and what would they say?
Well, where do you
What do you
want to?
think they would say?
Well, where do you want to go to lunch?
Yeah, where do you wanna go to lunch? And or, if they were like, "You choose this time." They're an extreme people pleaser. Would they choose from a place what would they choose? They'd choose
What the other person wants.
they'd try to guess, right? They'd try to guess what the other person wants, right? Now, let's say you told an extreme people pleaser, like the extreme pleaser person is talking to you and is asking you for advice. It doesn't have to be clinical advice, could just be friendly advice. And they're saying, like, hey, I want to stop people pleasing so much. What would you say to do instead? Instead of guessing what the other person wants, you should choose.
I'm thinking you want me to say what you want.
Is that were you trying to guess what I wanted to say you to say?
It seemed like there was an obvious answer that you were looking for me to fill in. I apologize, but yeah, no,
No, no, no, it's
I think
interesting, it's
logically that's
interesting to answer it that way. Yeah. I
no,
mean,
but
I guess I would say so too, because I just think, like, in terms of logically, I mean, that is the answer I was looking for, but if there's another answer, I'm interested. But I have thought about this question before, and I just think, like, in terms of logically, what else would it be? If you're not making a decision for other people, then what is your decision based on? Whose interests are you considering? You're probably considering your own interests, but, like, what type of interests? Like, what does that mean to kind of consider your own interests? I think when you say, like, you consider other people's interests, this is kind of like my own brain, and maybe it's like a psychopathic way of thinking, but I think, well, you're actually considering your own interests because you're still furthering your own interests by prioritizing the people that are closest to you because they're the people that are in like your inner circle. You rely on them. They support you in various ways, et cetera, et cetera. They share your genetic components. Some of them do, or they share, shared memories, or they do the dishes in the morning, or they don't, like whatever it is that they're kind of doing. Your identity is not just like you have a couple kind of blended identities as a sister, as a daughter, as a partner, as a colleague, as a whatever, as a friend. And you probably enjoy those identities, like they reflect you in some sort of way. And so I don't know, but the thing with when I went to my therapist, like, and the therapist was like, just choose, don't choose based on how it's going to affect other people. Just do something different. Like there was no something different there for me. Like I could not understand how to not choose based on other people because in a way I was like almost an extreme, like I told you, an extreme people pleaser, except
version of
extreme. Yeah.
serving yourself, kind
Yeah,
of.
because but in a weird way, I was forced to be because like an extreme even an extreme people pleaser, like we think of like the average extreme people pleaser, or I don't know, the vision of an extreme people pleaser that comes up in my mind is something that somebody who does have a preference, like they do want to go to Chick-fil-A, but they're saying let's eat Mexican instead because they want to people please, right? They're aware that they have a preference for Chick-fil-A and they override that in favor of other people. The difference between me and that version of an extreme people pleaser was that I did not have an awareness that I wanted to eat at Chick-fil-A. You know, I was just like the reason why I was manipulating is because I had to make choices based on something. And since I did not have like an awareness most of the time that I was even a person, then I that was kind of the only thing that was obvious to me. Like, okay, you make this choice and it makes this person happy or antagonizes this person. So let's choose those outcomes. And so that's why I was manipulating people all the time. Not necessarily because I was trying to like the choice of manipulation was a choice of outcomes, but it wasn't because I was like, I'm trying to get something out of this. Yeah, I was trying to get something out of this situation, but it wasn't a choice, I guess. It was like in the vacuum, the manipulation was the only thing that existed, and so that was the
Well,
only thing I could base choice on.
to me, that doesn't sound as much like manipulation. When I hear manipulation, I think intentional,
Mhm,
uh, like instrumenting, or I don't think that's exactly the word, but like orchestrating, right?
mhm.
It sounds like for you, this was an unintentional process. It was kind of more based on like absence or dearth of substance that someone was expecting you maybe to rely on and was resulting in problems for you, something like that.
Yeah, so, I mean, there was plenty of, like, orchestrating too, because it's like, okay, you're already manipulating this person about the lunch thing, you might as well manipulate them too about, like, their choice of profession or whatever, like, once you kinda go down that manipulating road and you realize that you do have influence over people, you might as well or you just kind of end up exercising the influence for the same reason that I had that budget of $2 a day for food in law school because you're just kind of you have to choose something to do, like there's so many hours in a day, like how do you choose what to do?
Well, um, Emmy, how do you feel about free will?
So I think free will is an interesting topic, and I do think like I believe all or like I understand the science and stuff, all the whatever behind it. um That we have limited free will because in a sense we have limited. I think the best way to kind of describe it is if you didn't know that Thai food existed, then you would never be able to answer, "Hey, I want Thai food for lunch." Right? And so how does something come to your awareness of whether or not it exists as a choice is something that we don't control, right? But once it does come to our awareness, I think we have a certain degree of control. So
And
that's how I
so,
feel about free will.
then in fact, were you manipulating, or did you just not have any other possible choices at hand?
I think it's both. Like, definitely to the person I was manipulating because was I doing certain things to try to affect them in a particular way? Yes. But was I intentional about it? Kind of, I was aware, but I did not have a choice to do something different in that moment. So I think that's what you're maybe trying to get at. I
Yeah.
did not have an alternative, like, I didn't had no viable alternative. It was kind of like it reminds me of, like, again, like, the cannibalism and Yellow Jackets or something. Like, I was reading about not related to Yellow Jackets, they call him the Colorado cannibal, and he kind of it was like misadventure, and they were trying to get it was during the gold rush, and they're trying to get some places, and then he somehow is found with like strips, not technically found, but he was like where his camp was. There were strips of human flesh, and they're like, "Okay, where'd you get this human flesh from?" Right? And so he kind of says, "I was put in this bad situation. I was forced to do this thing." but I also got on this like whole cannibalism kick. So I started reading about the Donner Party and all these different
Mm.
things. And people are put in these situations where it's like you may be disturbed, you not you, but you general. Somebody may be disturbed by the idea of cannibalism, but they kind of, at least one of the survivors of the Donner Party said, like, you've never had to have that choice. And in fact, it's not really a choice when you're kind of in that extreme of a situation. So I think that's the cannibalism example of the Donner Party is like a good example of how like I view some of my more psychopathic choices. Yeah. Is that like you're almost put in this situation where it's not much of a choice. You're not really aware that there's a choice, is at least a good way to put it.
And I mean, I think that's like I remember again the last time we spoke, excuse me, sorry, there was something that you mentioned about, kind of the trajectory or journey that you've been down as far as like kind of living and living and living and going through like youth and fun and then kind of coming to this realization that whoa, like things are not kind of falling into place the way I thought they would, or like I'm getting into trouble, having problems, and then there was like this like sort of self-awakening and reckoning. I don't want to speak for you. I'm just kind of,
Yeah, speak.
that's sort of how I remember it. Well, but I mean, please correct me if I said that. That
Absolutely.
was kind of how I remembered you putting it. And I remember my response in that moment being sort of like, yeah, I mean, it sounds like how most people grow up, right? Is we kind of fall all over the place and make tons of mistakes. And it doesn't mean we don't continue to make mistakes as we get older, but like I think a lot of getting older is sort of that realizing like, whoa, okay, I do need to maybe like pull back a little bit, pump the brakes, and do things a little differently if I want to get old.
Mhm.
um, and so where was I going with that? Is just kind of bringing it back to what you just said about the psychopath experience is like having limited choices. I think that is a largely universally human experience, right? Is we're all kind of struggling with, well, what do I have control over, right? Everyone's sort of, we're not tabula rasa. We are born with tons of substance, and we are so plastic and malleable as people. I barely believe in personality. I mean, I think it's there. I think there are things that are robust within us, but I think we're super um, uh, malleable to change, susceptible to change. And yeah, so I like what you're saying. I want to know more about your experience. I want to know what it's like to be you. I also really appreciate the insight that you're bringing to this as far as something that like I think that's a part of like your version of what a lot of people go through.
Yeah. And I will kind of go further about this. Like, I think kind of what you were saying, like we make mistakes or whatever. I think maybe my understanding, speaking from my own perspective of like the primary way that we make mistakes, like I as a child have a child's view of the world, and it doesn't track reality. It does track reality in some ways, but it doesn't, right? Like I remember vividly racking up this huge library fine of like $12, which sounded like $1,000,000 to me because I had never, like, maybe only had
That's
$1,
$12.
in all of my life or whatever. So I asked my parents, I was like, "Can you just write a check for that?" And they said, "Do you know what checks are? Do you know like how checks work or whatever? Checks are still money." I was like, "No, I don't know how checks work." But in my mind, that's how they worked, right? Is checks were kind of like this magical thing. And so we have like this view, almost like a narrative, like a self narrative. And so I kind of also agree with this about like the studies and free will and stuff, that we kind of conjure this narrative, and then our narrative gets it's mostly kind of our narrative that changes, like our understanding of reality, our understanding of ourself and our position in reality that changes because we think, well, that can't be true anymore now that I know this thing about checks, We're like you try to use a check and it bounces you and you're like, hold it, what? And then so you kind of learn either from personal experience or from people telling you, like, what is the nature of reality? Now, how much am I tracking reality right now? It's far from perfect, but I also think there are people, I can kind of tell there's people who are worse than I am. It's like once you're a certain height, you can tell that some people are shorter than you, right? Like you're like, oh, this person is not as much in reality as other people because they kind of like don't they're unable to see this aspect of reality, or they're kind of unable to perceive this. So I think I don't even know that it's so much a us changing as it is like the narrative that we have, this self-constructed narrative of who we are and who what the world is, that is doing the changing. I'm sure we changed too, like my brain has gotten worse, I can tell. As I've gotten older, my face looks different and stuff. I like prefer different things now than I used to prefer, but for sure know that my narrative has changed because it used to be actually pretty narrow, and that's kind of like a good way to put it. And the thing that was mostly missing from it, like the change from like 10 years ago to now, is that I just have included myself so much more in my narrative than I did before. Before, I was kind of like a first person narrator that you never
Mhm.
see. Like if you're playing like a first person shooter, like you can see your hands, hold the
Mhm.
gun, you can look down and maybe see your feet or whatever, but you never see you. You don't know, like you're not actually kind of part of the thing. And now I feel like I've like zoomed out enough um that I'm uh more cognizant of myself in the different situations. Like I can be like, "Oh yeah, I'm enjoying this and I'm a person that enjoys things like this, and I'm a person and a person is this." That there's like those additional kind of little sentences in which I kind of acknowledge my own personhood. And in acknowledging my own personhood, it's easier for me to understand and see the personhood of others.
I love that. Um, Mind if I ask some more questions about you and that?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Um, all right. So I guess I want to ask this. I also kind of want to just make sure I'm like giving you your due. I feel very strongly like I'm here on a call with Emily, not necessarily like a psychopath. I mean, I under is that how you identify as a psychopath? Is that one of your identifiers?
I would say that I have been diagnosed, and I'm not even sure what it means. Like, I don't think like, I think we have like a good definition of things like coronavirus. I don't think we have a good definition of things like multiple sclerosis. And I think I would put psychopath more on the side of multiple sclerosis than, kind of a fuzzier concept that's like a little bit more
Psychological
difficult.
constructs are extremely difficult to measure, and we've only just started like really developing scientific tools to help us measure them. But I was going to say what I want to ask about you, not just as someone who may or may not identify as a psychopath, but other things about you too that are just that's who I'm on the call with, not just. um, but that being said, you write about the sociopath condition. And I know that in the past you have identified as a psychopath or a sociopath, a person with antisocial personality disorder. Would you say on some level you still kind of do, or did you just kind of answer that and that's the best answer you got right now?
I actually, yeah, I have like a slightly different definition. I would say that I mostly identify as somebody who has a personality disorder. And I understand personality disorder, I think, a little differently than like a lot of people do. And maybe I'm like really wrong, or maybe I am correct about this, but I understand the personality disorder to be some disorder of like the personality. And I would use like the synonyms like your identity or your sense of self. So you have some kind of something in which that development of your individualization and
Mhm.
like being able to kind of differentiate yourself from your mom, right? Your primary caregiver, like around age 2 or something, did not quite happen the way it was supposed to. Like it did not fully develop. It did not like it wasn't like smooth sailing from then on to where it kind of developed in like a normal way that we would say somebody without a personality disorder has kind of like an awareness or perception of self, like integration of self, or all these kind of different words. So there are different like ways that the self can uh, that problems with your sense of self can manifest, and that's kind of essentially you get lumped under the personality disorder, and the different way like symptoms that you have as a result of it kind of get labeled with the different types of personality disorders that tend to struggle with different things. As I mentioned before, that thing that I posted on Twitter, like the fear that psychopaths have is related to control, whereas this is a common one that you hear with borderline personality disorder, that they fear abandonment. That's the part that really kind of is the rub with them. Now, I don't even think like those symptoms or whatever are super stable, kind of as I said before, like, I used to think my love language was touch, but then once I got enough touch, then it wasn't. So I think some of this stuff is just kind of like kind of a moving target. I think it's difficult, but I would say, yeah, I have a personality disorder, and the symptoms that I have with regard to personality disorders match mostly antisocial personality disorder, but I have also aspects of like Asperger's probably, and I also have aspects of obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Tell me more.
Yeah. So like the obsessive compulsive personality disorder, I do have like a tendency to have like
You're
hmm?
saying OCPD more than not
Yeah.
OCD. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so because I don't really have obsessive behavior so much as I have like compulsive thoughts. Like it's hard. I see it too, like, especially in one of my siblings and in my dad. Like, if you interrupt them, they will start over at the beginning of an explanation. Like, they really have to kind of like say it in that particular order or whatever, because it's like a rut. It's like having like a rut in your thinking, like the album or whatever keeps skipping or something and keep playing that,
To
and you
me,
kind
it
of have
feels
to.
like a block got pulled out of the Jenga tower and it all fell apart. Now you got to like rebuild the whole thing. Like it's either a whole
Yes.
or yeah, all or nothing.
Yeah, that all or nothing. And so that and then I would say too, kind of like with intrusive thoughts that I've experienced, it can get like it has a weird way of playing out with the compulsive thinking. Like you can kind of like fixate on an intrusive thought. And I feel like some of the kind of like more evil things that I thought actually are just like an intrusive thought that's kind of like gotten caught up in like this compulsive way of thinking that also kind of blends with like this desire to control
Mhm.
and to like manifest myself, like manifest myself in the world and how I kind of see it. Have you seen like the Invisible Man or whatever, these movies where he's invisible, but you can tell he's there because he pushes a cup and you see it move, right? That's how I sometimes have felt, is that like I sometimes when I feel especially kind of like empty or like existential angst, like I kind of have the sense that I'm not corporeal enough in the world, I'm not embodied enough in the world, like I don't kind of like feel myself enough in the world, and it kind of like I want to like feel that I am a thing, is that I will try to influence the world around me so I can see my effect, so I know that I exist.
So concretely, just because there's so much in there that I could unpack, and I also just want to put out there, I'm a therapist. I don't want to like accidentally treat this like it's like a therapy. So please let me know again if there's something that you don't want to answer or like you want to answer in a different, like I know I have that bias. So if I'm like being too personal or anything, like going down the wrong path, please feel free to let me know. Let's just stick with personality disorder at its, take out what kind or what flavor, anything else. Do you still feel like you fit that criteria? Which I would agree with that. I know it was in like your list of questions for me to consider. What do I sort of believe to be, like the thing that gets personality disorders to hang together? What's the common thread there? And that was sort of what I landed on too. Is what I've learned and what I've experienced personally is when there seems to be some sort of um, like core fundamental identity disturbance that often individuals will kind of go through life like really trying on seemingly very different personalities, without necessarily recognizing it as a problem or experiencing it as a problem, right? It might be fine to them, but it sounds like that is something that you're still kind of experiencing, like sort of a, what do you think?
I would
The identity.
say in a way, like I haven't had experience with like AA, but I would say that it kind of feels like, let's say you're like however many days sober or something, but you still know you have kind of those tendencies, or you have like a ankle that got sprained and it's healed, but it's not strong. I would say it's kind of like that. Like it's not a yes or no. It's kind of like I have those tendencies. I have those, like that is still something that like my brain feels is comfortable, like if I could kind of like slip into it kind of without like maybe realizing even for just like a particular kind of situation or something, and kind of recognize some of my old thinking, some of my old behaviors kind of cropping up a little bit. But I would say that I probably am undiagnosable even with a personality disorder now because yeah, I think of things like things manifest themselves in a spectrum, and not everybody who has like little, well, not anybody who has anything is, you could have like some blood sugar issues without being diabetic. So that's that's probably how I would say. Like I did have a personality disorder, maybe I still do kind of, but it's like in treatment or something, or it's like I'm a recovering alcoholic. I still have that. I'm even if I'm sober, I'm not normal.
That's fantastic. I mean, I want to extend congratulations. That's a big accomplishment to feel like you kind of, it sounds like you're saying you sort of transitioned from early life feeling like, yes, personality disorder, that was me, and now with some work, maybe less so. That is that
Yeah.
kind of what you're.
Yeah, I do feel like what the sensation that I felt like really characterized me before, like where I was like, yeah, personality disorder is correct, where there was like a lot of instability or lack of kind of stability. I don't know if those are synonyms in my identity and like sense of self. Like I have, like I have established like a foundation, understanding, and connection to my identity. I feel like I do have a sense of self, is a good way to put it. Like I have a stronger sense of self.
That's great. I mean, look, this is the second time I've spoke with you, and I feel a strong sense of who you are that I know is very limited by time and experience, right? Like and situation, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, I still feel like, at least compared to the last time I talked to you and the emails that I received to you, you seem pretty stable in who you are. Like I get the same feeling and sense when I interact with you every time. But more importantly, I hope that this is a positive change for you to feel a little bit more stable. Do you feel like this is like a healthful change in you, or something that you sort of resent, or neither, or both, or?
Yeah, I would say helpful. And you probably, maybe you thought that I'm not saying, I won't even guess what you thought. Like I could see how like the question that I was asking you before about like how do you decide where to go to lunch? Maybe that kind of seems like a small thing and to some people. And maybe it kind of seems like almost like this nitpicking or whatever. But that was like the biggest unknown for me. Like I could not answer that. And it just was, that's kind of disturbing. Like if you're you're clipping along or whatever, you're doing whatever, you're like in law school, you like become a lawyer, you become a law professor, sure, sure, sure. But you can't answer this like basic question without kind of like acting like these extreme people pleasers and just like basing your decision on somebody else's reactions or something. That always felt like it made every choice that I made feel really meaningless, and that there was like an absurdism and kind of boredom because without having like that sense of self, you're not engaged personally in anything. Like you don't take anything personally. There's kind of no person there to have it, or no sense, no connection to that person that you are, in order for you to like feel really truly excited about something, in a sustainable way, or really truly sad about something in a sustainable way. And so I think it's been very life enriching, but more than that, it's been like sanity preserving because I can't even imagine keep living like that. Like the absurdity of living like that would have just like eventually eaten away at my brain, I
Yeah.
feel.
No, I hear you. And then I will again, I'm really glad to hear that that's where things have taken you. And look, when you say like, is it nitpicking, or is it kind of splitting up, like making a mountain out of a molehill? Like I'm getting a PhD in cognition. Like I've got a very intense special interest in the way people think and make decisions, and what motivates us, why people do it. So you're preaching to the choir here, but um, on intense interests, you did mention some identification with feelings of Asperger disorder
Huh.
or what are your thoughts there?
So I would say, and let me try to, like, I don't know that much. I have not researched this. I don't even know that much about psychopaths. I tried to kind of like what you were saying before about like I do not think of myself as primarily uh anything like psychopath, musician, lawyer. I think of myself as kind of like the process of the thoughts. So it is kind of like I don't know that much about like the autism spectrum, and I don't know that much about Asperger's, but there are certain, and I think uh maybe it would help if you asked me like, "Hey, this is something that's common in Asperger's. Is this like something that you experience?" Because I don't know enough to kind of know what parts of my experience would track with Asperger's. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I can do that, and I certainly will. But I am still interested to hear why you said it.
Yeah, why I
You
said
were the
it.
one
One
to
of
bring
the
it up. It's all over my notes, but you were the one to say it.
I guess kind of like there are a couple things that I am aware are associated with it. And like things like kind of taking things literally is a good one. Like I've in learning about myself, I've come to understand that I really love sincerity. Like I'm always sincere, and it's so funny because like
Mhm.
as a psychopath I basically was 0 sincere. Now I'm like 100% sincere, and I would just prefer, like, sincerity over all things, and I don't understand sarcasm, or I don't even kind of like to engage with it, like, you were kinda talking about before, like, is there anything kind of visually or with the senses that is kind of, like something I don't like. And I would
Mhm.
say that like lack of sincerity is something that I don't like. It kind of makes me cringe. It's not like a sense thing, but it's something like when I see it in other people, lack of sincerity or hypocrisy. I think I tend to see things like that a little bit like rigidly, kind of like in black and white, where I really do prioritize, have like kind of like I don't have strong kind of moral leanings, but I have a very strong aesthetic about sincerity, that
Mhm.
whenever I see lack of sincerity, and I can kind of tend to see like things related to it in black and white terms too, like truth and error. Like I tend to kind of be like, no, that was a lie, and somebody's like, well, I didn't mean it to be a lie or something, and I'm like, well, here's the definition of lie, and it meets the definition, so therefore lie.
But it also sounds like you likely empathized with them on some level to be able to perceive that.
So have I would say that I don't understand if this is even a thing. So the word empathy, I perspective take. I like that word kind of better because it suggests, I think, more like what it feels like to me on the inside. When people say that they feel other people's feelings, I don't know that I believe that.
Mhm.
I have like a big question mark in my head about it, where like kind of I'll just put a pin in that about
Well,
whether I believe that.
we never feel other people's feelings, but
But
I there
people say it. They say like,
yeah,
"Oh,
no,
I."
and I said it earlier too. But I think that's a cheat, right, or a hack to, or a shortcut of saying like, our brains and our central nervous systems seem to have a mechanism. I don't know how familiar you are with like mirror neuron
Yeah,
research.
mirror neurons.
Yeah, and I mean, even put that aside, like that's newer research that I think is really compelling and um, has a lot of promise. But even more than that, we know that babies learn to imitate.
Mhm.
Right? It's one of the first things we do. And when babies don't imitate, we notice that as something like, oh, they're not mimicking other people. So I think that perhaps that mirror neuron system, still being researched and being understood. There's something in us though that causes us to mimic one another. And so I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. I think we grow up mimicking the behaviors of others, but I do also think that a lot of people kind of innately will feel or mimic what they think someone else is feeling, and it is projective, right? It is
Mm.
completely biased. I will never say that I'm feeling what someone else is, the same way I always say, like, you're the expert on you. It's never my job as a therapist, as a friend, as a conversation partner, whatever, to say what someone else thinks or feels. um, but I've had evidence over and over and over that show, you know people often agree when I say like my version of what I've mirrored back to them is correct. And sometimes I'm absolutely wrong, like sometimes I'm way off. But I think that's kind of what it's going for, is the brain sort of mimics what someone else is going through. And it does cause this sort of pro-social chain of behaviors, i.e. altruism.
Can cause that.
When it's there, and I think that's kind of like,
Can also cause like real quick, like just a pushback can cause like mob mentality and other like forms of group brutality.
absolutely. No, and thank you for saying that. Absolutely. And like tons of times when we imitate things, it's wrong. That's why we have a frontal lobe to help us moderate and make decisions and consider, okay, am I just supposed to do what that person is doing? Or is something else the right thing to do? Right. But it's kind of like one of the more fundamental, it's an advanced function, but I think it's something that's present in many humans that often leads to just some of the social behaviors that humans have. I don't remember where we started. That
So
is my area of research. So that one I will soapbox on all day long. I think we were talking about like uh, rigidity of thinking, and I was asking about Asperger's, and that was kind of what you were starting to get at. But please go at it. If
yes,
there's anything you want to disagree with me on, or anything, please do.
no, I'll tell you more. So like the I one time are they EEGs, the like brainwave activities? Is that what we call them? EEG?
So EEGs measure neural synchrony, right?
Hmm.
So if there's an area of the brain, and it's pretty limited actually to like scalp activity. So
Yeah.
anything that's like right up here, things that are
Hmm.
deep in there, like the amygdala,
Hmm.
like the fear emotion center of the brain, much harder to measure via EEG. But up on the surface, we can get readings of basically like where there's a lot of neural activity happening at once. Yeah.
Yeah. So one time for insomnia, I started seeing this guy, a neurobiofeedback guy. Have you ever heard about this? They'll like hook you up to like EEG guy, and they're trying to get you to it's kind of interesting. They'll have like four boats, because is it alpha beta something and another wave that the
And
brain's
Delta,
doing?
you're talking about sleep waves.
Yeah, well, beta is the sleep wave, right? So he's trying to kind of get me to like understand what it feels like in my brain when those are the primary brains, and they do it with visual feedback. So like I'm like looking at like almost like I'm playing a video game with my brain, right? I'm looking at boats, and if I'm like alpha, then it's the red boat, and if it's beta, then it's the green boat, and if it's whatever, then it's doing these things. But before we started doing that like feedback, he was like, I'm just going to take like a basic map, kind of like 15 minutes of me watching like white noise, like kind of static on TV or whatever for 15 minutes. And then he was like, we'll just kind of use that as a baseline reading. And then when he was going over the reading, he was like, and I want to be sensitive, kind of raising this next issue, this next thing that I saw, and it's not super unusual. And in fact, we see it more in the autism spectrum uh population, but like this area of your brain that's associated with like recognizing faces and emotions is like very low activity.
Mhm.
So I yeah, that is just it's another autism thing.
Yeah, no, probably commenting on the fusiform gyrus. We sometimes call it the fusiform face gyrus. If I had to guess, I don't know, but that is an area of the brain that's often implicated as having like weak activity in people with autism, for sure. So, I mean, what is your thought of that? Do you feel like you have a hard time paying attention to people's faces or looking them in the eye, anything like that? Memory for faces?
I haven't noticed it. I don't know if it's maybe, I often kind of wonder like with whatever, how did my genes play out because I've been socialized female, because I've been whatever, like I do notice that for instance that my like I have a niece who's just like so ever since she was like a baby, super interested in like knew everybody's names. I'm like, how do you know Uncle so and so's name? Like you've seen him like once, but just kind of like really that sort of stuff is like prominently on her radar. And I
Mhm.
would say that that sort of stuff had it on my radar kind of from my memories, more in terms of like orchestrating. Like I need to kind of like factor in more of the things that are happening because I was always trying to kind of like understand as many variables as I could in a situation. So I think that I started thinking of people kind of clinically, but I don't think I probably did think of people ever, kind of like in this kind of like I'm naturally interested and see them as people way.
But so I want to ask, what did you mean a second ago? And you said you would try to, you said remember as much about people as you could, but not like for them or something. Yeah, could you
Yeah, kind
clarify?
of like data mining is a word that I used to use all the time. Like I have an Excel spreadsheet of information about you that I've collected about you
I would love
in my
to
head, not an actual Excel spreadsheet. And I used to, when my brain was better, I used to have like be able to remember so many things and like keep it like all there or whatever. And now I'm kind of like, I'm glad that those things are falling off the cliff into like the memory hole.
Mhm, mhm.
'Cause
Um,
again, I don't like to be aware of all this stuff, I don't kind of like to see everybody's weaknesses. I don't wanna understand that like, have, like, body dysmorphia because then it's kind of a sad thing. Now I understand it to be a sad thing, and I probably always was sad about it when I was little, but I just kind of was like I think I thought that things were, like, ugly and disordered, like, it was, like, kinda leaning into this autism thing, like, I think that's also kind of the obsessive compulsive like personality disorder, like this having like this strong aesthetic for things that kind of like make sense and people often don't make sense. And I think that it bothered me. Like I think that I had a hard time understand like kind of respecting that about people.
sure. There are pretty well documented similarities between, oh, sorry, I get bugged by bugs. Similarities between antisocial personality and an autism spectrum. Um, I think overall we kind of nailed the main one is sort of that diminished compared to most people like preference for paying attention to other people and their wants and needs, right? So I actually like um, and I've also seen and read it documented with like similarly with autism and narcissism, right? It's similar kinds of call it disinterest in people, but I hate to be black and white in anything. I think lots of people with autism and antisocial personality, narcissistic personality, lots of people have interest in people and motivation to interact with people. But overall, I think this difficulty empathizing or with perspective taking, like you're saying. So I wouldn't be surprised if you were to say something like, it sounds like there's less identification with personality disorder, you said before, right? I also, I was just kind of making my own hypotheses. I was making sure I know what the DSM calls antisocial personality disorder, again, since this really isn't like I kind of more come from the autism world. But I was looking through the DSM criteria for APD and thinking like, I know I don't know you well, but you don't seem to come off as irritable or aggressive, or you know overall irresponsible. It seems like you probably have a history with that, but I know you also, I think, have struggled with motivation. Why am I doing certain things? And or things like failure to conform to lawful norms, right? I think you follow the law, or at least there's enough of that that you haven't ended up in jail, right? I was kind of going through these and it's like, I don't know if she would still meet criteria, and I'm way too naive to make an answer or a real judgment call on that. But I wonder if things have maybe moved more towards like, okay, maybe there's a little bit of that. There still might be some difficulty with perspective taking. And again, I'm not going to diagnose like with autism or Asperger's or anything, but I'm not surprised to hear you say that you maybe identify with some characteristics that those individuals are known to sometimes. Did that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, I would say, and I'm not, this is not my kind of expertise. I usually like the DSM-5, my understanding of some of the, let's say, kind of like problems with the antisocial personality disorder diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
is my understanding is that it seems to kind of be tracking like two types of people who have kind of similar behavior, like similar, let's just kind of say like criminal, recidivist type behavior. And one of them is kind of somebody who kind of comes from a place of like high reactivity to stimulus and like emotional reactivity. So I was reading about this guy who got out of prison, and then he, for something bad like rape or something, and then he went home and he got really jealous and he killed his wife and his son. Right. So then he went back to prison. Right. And I don't
But
really
jealous?
see, yeah, I don't really see in that like myself. That
Right.
person also would be diagnosed antisocial personality disorder. Then you'd have somebody that I do kind of see more uh like honestly like a Ted Bundy kind of guy would be like a good example of this other kind who's like reactivity to everything, is kind of doing stuff if anything because there's not, it's more kind of like a disconnection instead of like a hyper connection to what's happening around you, I guess is kind of a good way to put it. So I think of those, that's kind of my understanding of like some of the difficulty with antisocial personality disorder. And you sometimes hear in the psychopathy research, like some of the articles about like factor one, factor two, or like primary and secondary psychopathy, or is there a distinction between sociopath and psychopath? And sometimes people say this, that the one is kind of like really hot-headed, and the other one's cold-hearted, is kind of like a good way to like shorten it. Now, I don't have like opinions about this. I guess I'm kind of saying though that it's there seems to be like it seems to be conflating something, unless there's some overarching explanation for like the same cause is causing like two really different kind of ways of kind of interacting with the world. But that's, like, my understanding of antisocial personality disorder is they haven't really bothered to kind of, like, separate that, and I do think that there's some, like, level of controversy about it because of that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that I wonder if, well, let me say this. The DSM-5, I will give a ton of credit to. It is certainly, what I make diagnoses from, and especially as a current student, like I certainly am deferent to the diagnostic system. It is, that being said, a highly imperfect system by which there's a lot of subjectivity involved, and we really have not done a whole I shouldn't say not. There's been research, but the DSM largely is not based on etiology. So like what's causing anything. Um, it's based on observable symptoms. What I have sort of viewed, I can't really speak exactly to what you're saying just because I don't have the familiarity with people who identify or are diagnosed with as having antisocial personality disorder. But um, you know, I certainly will keep that in mind, that dichotomy of like, okay, you know, cold-heartedness, hot-blooded, high reactivity. And that also was one of your questions, you know, like emotional reactivity or under-reactivity. And I've got some other thoughts on that, but I wonder if what may tie those two together is sort of like similar motivation for doing things the way they do, that you know, to kind of bring us back to where we started, is tends to sort of have little regard for others, right? Um, and that kind of takes some work to realize that that's a possibility, is to
Yeah.
have that flexibility in decision making. But what do you think of that as sort of being like a tie between the two?
Do you think they're tied that way? And that's, I think, why they're currently under that umbrella. I guess these kind of questions I have are why I feel more comfortable now, not identifying as antisocial personality disorder, but still identifying as personality disordered. You know, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I have a personality disorder that has probably, like, of the personality disorders, you know, I feel like I have the most in common with that one and obsessive compulsive personality disorder in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like the way uh that my difficulties with sense of self manifest themselves behaviorally.
Mm-hmm. How much time do you have?
Um, I I could probably go like another 30, but we can also wrap it up here and just do another one because we've been talking for a long time. I always find that breaks are good.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm happy to take a break. Basically I just I've got two thoughts, because like I said, I don't want to just focus on things like psychopathology. I am interested in learning more about you outside of that realm. I sort of want to talk a little bit about ADHD. So I'm like not quite ready to leave that boat, but you know, I would also love to hear more about what it's like to be you outside of
Absolutely.
DSM.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts? I've got time. I can stop here if that's what you prefer. I can
No,
keep
let's keep going.
going.
It's good. It's on ADHD. I don't know that much about ADHD. I do know
Can
that
I ask you
like
a specific question more?
oh yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How do you feel? How do you? What's your understanding of executive function? Are you comfortable with that term?
No. Or it's not like I have like a vague sense of it, but I probably need like a little bit more.
Yeah. So executive functioning is a very wide umbrella term that kind of largely broadly encompasses like complex thinking abilities. So, like up in the frontal lobe, things like planning, organizing, abstract thought versus concrete, flexibility. Uh, I think I already said organization, time management. Do these kinds of activities, cognitively and behaviorally in practice, do you feel like those are things that you've ever noticed like particular strengths or weaknesses in?
So I would say that, and this is pretty common with the people that I meet too,
Mm-hmm.
is that like one person described it as a chaos brain, and the other one described it as like a crazy lateral way of thinking, and to kind of like contrast it with like linear thinking, like a structured thinking, like the thought relates to one another kind of in a linear way. If I have to do linear thinking, I almost always like it's so against the grain for my
Okay.
brain to think this way that I have to like listen to like classical music or minimalist music. And that kind of like helps, like, I think hearing the music temporally, linearly in time helps structure like the thinking a little bit better. Like it soothes the brain. But other than that, like if I do it without the music, like I can kind of almost like You know how you like when your laptop is getting like really, really hot, you know, it's like overworked or whatever.
It
That's
sounds
how
like
it
it's gonna fly
feels.
away. Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm not listening to the music, I can just be like, "Ah."
And do you think that's more like emotional impatience or like you were saying like it helps you think in a more organized, linear way?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a good question. Like, is it an emotional impatience? I think it's kind of like a physical discomfort is how I feel it. Like,
Okay.
kind of if you are,
Yeah, where's the physical
like a
discomfort?
stress. Like it's like I can feel like cortisol kind of like building up in my system where I'm like suddenly kind of frazzled. So it's like it's not a non-emotional component or whatever, but it does feel kind of like a physical fidgetiness.
Are you fidgety?
Oh, and I've talked to other people too that say that they like respond really well to like Ritalin and Adderall.
Have you ever
No,
taken
but
psychostimulants
did I
before?
get a should I get a prescription? I
I
do
cannot
caffeine.
say comment on whether I'm under an alias or not, but
Uh-huh.
I was wondering towards the beginning of our conversation, I forget exactly what it was. I think it was because I was asking about sleep, right? And I
Mhm.
mentioned, I'm really interested to hear your motivation and ability to be structured and sleep 10 hours a night. And I think this will be a topic for a different day. I'm really interested to know how your self care practices may be impacted by the feelings that also allow you to identify as a psychopath sometimes or have in the past. But I think we went from like I had to let go of that self-care line because our conversation jumped like around a few places, which was great. I love it. Like I really like where our conversation went. But I also
Chaos
was
brain.
like, look, I get it too. I've been diagnosed with ADHD. I think a lot of people are diagnosed with ADHD. Mine came late in life. I very strongly identify with it, more in the hyperactive way, but I also can be very disorganized by nature. And I did just sort of feel the conversation going in like 7 directions at once, which again was awesome. Like, it means you're an interesting person. I liked everything that we were talking about, but I kind of had a thought at one point. I was like I take Adderall every day, and I was like, oh, I wonder if she's ever tried it or like what the response is like. For the most part, people tend to like concentration helps just about everyone. I am not a psychiatrist; I can't prescribe or comment on meds, but I wonder if you've ever thought what that might be like, or if you've ever tried it, or
I do, I mean, I drink caffeine, but not like crazy, not even like coffee, except, you know, like on this most recent trip I was on, I wasn't able to sleep like the 10 hours. And so then I was like drinking double espressos, but it like didn't really make me jittery at all. It just helped the brain to like work for another 90 minutes. So I called it
you're
my
also
medicine.
probably pretty habituated to the effects of caffeine at this. If you have you been consuming caffeine for a long time?
Yeah, but I it's like Diet Cokes, like 3 or 4 Diet Cokes or something a day.
Okay, it for a long time habitually.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay. And you feel still like it kind of what did you say you think it does to your brain or feels like?
Like, if I especially if it's kind of like a bad sleep or something, like, it just feels like the brain, like, clicks back into, like it's working correctly is what I said, but kind of like almost like this harmony, like it's kind of, like, functioning well. You know, like, when you hear something, like, about your fridge or your car or something where you're like, "That doesn't sound right."
Mhm.
And then other
Yeah,
times where it's like purring, you know, like it's like, okay, you know, like
like
this is
oiling the
good.
joints.
Yeah, and I feel this way too. Like I have like a deep sense of distrust when I can tell that the brain kind of the same way too. Like if you hear like another appliance or your car or something kind of not making a weird sound, you have like this sense like of foreboding, like of dis-ease, like, oh, you know, distrust. You don't trust the brain to do right by you. And yeah, so that's why I take the double espresso as the medicine.
On it. All right, Emmy, I want to ask you, and like each of these could be their own hours long conversation, but I would love to know about things other than psychopathology or
Yeah, let's
whatever.
do it. Let's do it. Come on.
Yeah, what are your preferences for things like fiction and nonfiction? Do you have strong preferences?
I stopped reading books because like my brain was like, this is like too hard, kind of.
Do
Like
you
I was
feel
doing
like
too
sustained attention activities are difficult for you?
yes.
Okay. Go on. Sorry to interrupt you.
Like, I used to read books like crazy, like, I could, like, read for, like, 6 hours a day. Now, it's not necessarily that I think I've kind of just I use that same brain that used to read the books, I use it for different things now, like, for practicing my music or for, like doing law work or for writing or for whatever else. And it's funny, like even when I was a law professor, I used to love to teach at night because teaching or even kind of having a conversation like this, it will like burn my brain, and then afterwards I'm like dead for like an hour or two or something. Like I
Mhm,
can't really do anything. But
mhm,
if I did it at night, then I would just go to sleep. And
mhm.
so I like would always structure like my like needing to write an academic article or something like in the early afternoon because the brain is, like, still bad in the morning, it needs to wake up.
Okay.
And then I'd teach, like, in the late afternoon into the evening, and I, like, love that schedule.
Mhm. So you don't read anymore. Do you
Mm-mm.
do you think I mean
Like, I
have
read
you
articles, I just don't read books. Part of it is, like, a weird preference, honestly, now for, like this is gonna sound narcissistic probably. I feel like I don't wanna be influenced by other people's thinking really right now. I feel like the thinking that I wanna do and this has been since, like for, like, 10 years or something. And maybe I kind of picked it up as an academic where it was like, okay, I want to be aware of these things, but I don't want to be so kind of like caught up in other people's ideas that I don't have space for my own ideas. Because I'm more interested in my own ideas and
Yeah.
generating those.
Which I mean kind of maps on pretty solidly with what you were saying before is like developing more of this sense of like who I am, what I want, what motivates me,
Hmm.
right? That you were kind of. I mean, I think that sounds great. I've recently had a similar experience where I love reading. I've consumed books like they were cookies or something. I am bad at metaphors. Since I was like, I've just always been an avid reader, and I recently have just like in the last year keep finding like I don't like this book. I keep putting it down. I keep putting it down, and like I don't think it's even an attention thing as much as it's just like it's not what I want. It's constantly not what I want. And finally, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna write my own books. Like
Nice.
instead of like reading before bed, I'm gonna go like write my own. So we'll see if I can write a book. If you have any tips.
Uh-huh.
um, what about art? Any preferences for art styles?
Yes. But I think I don't know if there's like this was probably an autistic thing to say. Mondrian, do you know the Piet Mondrian?
He's
He has
the
like
Dutch
the red,
artist.
yellow, blue
Yeah,
squares.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 I got my mom a bag of and she was just asking me the other day if I left it at her house, but I didn't know his name, so
Yeah.
yes.
So Mondrian and he's like a kind of right pre-Renaissance painter slash the very beginning of the Renaissance Giotto, Giotto.
Okay.
It's totally he was kind of like known because pre-Renaissance perspective they had lost the technology of perspective, painting with perspective, like 3D. Uh, so, but he kind of was like the first to do it. And there's just something like about like the way that he portrays people. Like he usually did religious topics, and there's like one of Jesus, who's dead in the painting, like in the lower left, and then there are like five angels up in the sky who are just like inconsolable. Their little angel faces are like, I don't know. And maybe because it's so primitive, both of them, they're primitive. Like I have a really hard time understanding poetry, like
Mhm.
really hard time understanding poetry.
Can often be very abstract and not as concrete, right? I mean,
Yeah.
does that ring a bell?
Yes.
And yeah, okay. I don't like poetry either, typically. But
It's not that I don't like it, like, if I get it, then I can be like, "Oh, that's cool," like, I do understand it. It's really hard for me to follow, though, I guess. And I understand, like, times people will say, like, with music, like, "Oh, I have a hard time hearing the bass." You know, I just hear it as, like, a wall of sound, and that's how I feel about poetry, is that I just cannot penetrate it. Penetrate that wall of just, like, words.
do you feel like you enjoy Mondrian's art? Does it? I'm not too familiar with his
Mhm.
work, but I'm just kind of drawing some inferences based on the things we've talked about today and what you just how you just described his work. But would you say there's kind of like a genuineness or honesty in his work?
Yes, an energy. Yeah, like a ray of sunshine, like the sun itself. Like it's kind of reflecting like the same way the sun, it just feels like energy, like light energy, joy.
Say more about that. I'm not sure what you mean.
Yeah, like I really like to be joyful and I like other people that are joyful and I feel like you often get kind of like so this is a music analogy and do you know the kettle drums, timpani?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Music
dun
I can
dun
do.
dun dun dun. Yeah, in orchestras and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
when you tune them, they're pitched, right? That's why it sounds like dun dun dun. But you have to, they have all these they're on a rim. Like professional timpani, it's like an animal skin that they put on, and like other types of timpani, they have like a plastic head or something. But it's like this whole rim that's like 32 inches in diameter is often like the bigger timpani, and so you have to make sure that, like, the head is what's called clear. You have to clear the head. It's kind of like Scientology. Like, that's why I think
Meaning,
it's yeah, you have to make sure it's in tune with itself. So,
okay.
like, if this, on the left is like a half pitch lower than on the right, so you have to kinda go through and clear them. And, like, a really good timpanist can hear, like, when they hit it, you can hear, like, the pitch, like, "dun." There's, like, a little drop off. Like, one of the non-primary, screws? Tightening the lugs is what we call them. One of the non-primary lugs is lower. Like, you can hear kind of in the pitch where something is, like, not in the right tension, and once it's clear, then it plays, like, just "ba," like a normal, like, really pure, kinda tone. And, that's a little bit what it sounds like, but here's, like, another kind of music thing, because not everything sounds best pure. Sometimes things sound, like, best when they're, like, very dirty and colorful. So, like, in triangle
Like
playing,
you
like,
make
if you
music, you were saying earlier, right?
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, if you play the triangle and it has just, like, a pure tone, like, "Boo," that's bad triangle playing. You want the triangle to be like a whole spectrum, like a prism, like light hitting a prism, and it makes a rainbow. You want
Mhm.
there to be a rainbow of sound from the triangle.
Similar to, I mean, I grew up playing the clarinet when you warble a little bit and play with your
Mhm.
yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I, good music doesn't always come from just repeating it perfectly, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, what about math? How do you like math?
Math?
Yeah.
So I took calculus again, when I was in college, and I'm not in college, and as a law professor, I took calculus again because I was interested in empirical work. And then when I found out that
You're interested
the
in, say that again. You were interested in empirical.
empirical work, like statistical, like doing experiments and stuff, when I found out that, like, the derivative is the same as the now I forget the word for it. The derivative is the same as the
Calc, I don't know.
yeah, let me look it up. But when I found out that they're, like, the exact opposite, and they were derived from, like, completely different, uh, kind of, like, thought experiments, I was just like, "So, yeah, the derivative is opposite of the integral." I was like, "What?" I cried. I was like, "This is, like, so beautiful." I love logic. I love, like, so the LSAT is what you take the law school admissions test. Like, I love to kind of like, when I finally understand that you can reduce language to, like, pure meaning, then I was
Here's
interested in language. And I was interested in writing finally, and finally my writing, like, made any amount of sense. but
Interesting.
it
I love that. I loved my logic class in college. And I will also share a secret about me, which is my parents are both attorneys. I
mhm.
think I've got kind of a similar preference in that way for like things fitting and being able to reduce down to component parts of an equation, which is like a sentence. You know, it goes with both numbers and words. Yeah, I don't know anything about calculus, unfortunately, but let's stick with the law for a second. What do you think about banning abortions? What, as far as what you think the laws should be, logically, morally, however you want to answer it. I know it was a little bit of a jump from
Uh-huh.
math to there, but I'm kind of taking the link with like logic, law. You are that is your expertise. I would love to hear what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I think my personal preference generally is for efficiency. So whatever kind of promotes efficiency. And I understand I kind of define efficiency broadly as like what makes the most sense. Like what causes the fewest problems, what like causes the most kind of productivity or utility or enjoyment that people
Fewest effects.
experience, yeah, in life. I think for things like abortion, like, that I can kinda understand really well, uh, in a particular sense. This sense where it's like if a baby is 6 weeks old, we all agree that nobody can kill that baby, right? And if a baby is, like, not even a baby because it's sperm hitting, like, that the sperm that never, like, gets released, that's not a baby either, you know? And I guess some people kind of like are like, "Well, what about contraception or something?" But I think most people don't think contraception should be prohibited. So let's say sperm hitting like a condom instead of being like exposed potentially to like an egg in the uterus. Like most people can agree that that's not a baby, right? Those extremes. And then the question then is just when does it become a baby? Somewhere in the middle. But where do you draw the line? And I think when we are asking these questions about drawing the line, it's kind of like where do you draw the line between somebody who is diagnosable with a personality disorder or somebody who's not? Somebody who's like just before I was just reading about this study, like the vaccination for chickenpox. I guess in Scotland or something, they were like, if you were born before September 13th, 20 2003 or something, you don't get it. So if you're
Okay.
like born the very next day, you do get it, and if you're born that day or before, you don't get it. Like whenever we draw lines, it's always arbitrary. Uh, almost always. Like there are few
We
exceptions. That's kind
try
of
to
why I
make it,
said, yeah,
yeah.
coronavirus is different than multiple sclerosis because it's more capable of drawing that line. Another good example would be like I have an uncle and aunt with Down syndrome. It's really easy to diagnose Down syndrome because you just check their like
Either
DNA,
present
they
or
have the
not.
additional
Yeah.
chromosome. You don't have to say, oh, they look like it or they act like it or they whatever.
Can I add to this really quick? I think what you're referring to is the difference between a categorical, like a binary,
Hmm.
they have it or don't, versus a more dimensional, they've got this degree of it, or that where, when a fetus becomes viable is kind of, around the 25th week or so, but some, we try hard to define it objectively, and some things are easier to define objectively than others. I think that's kind of what you're going for, right?
Yeah. So in these situations in which I forget the non-categorical in the law, we have the words we use
Dimensional
are,
or spectrum.
yeah, dimensional. Yeah, we use the words bright line rule versus a standard. The standard is dimensional. So like something like drive safely is dimensional, and don't exceed 65 miles per hour is categorical, right? So that's a bright line rule. You can write them both ways, but some things are not capable of kind of even thinking that way. And in those situations, I think, well, it's probably just got to be like this democratic majority rules type situation where most people think this or something, and that's why we have federalism and people can like vote with their feet and stuff. And so I guess that's how I feel about it, about the law.
And so do you prefer that flexibility in law to try to make things a little bit more up to people, being able to look at sides of things rather than yes or no?
Yeah, so everything is a trade-off, in terms of, like, what you choose to structure things as. If you, for instance, have the don't exceed 65 miles per hour and somebody goes 66 miles per hour, does that make them, like, so much more culpable somehow? Like, they're suddenly a bad person, whereas the person going 65 is totally okay,
Well, it
totally
usually
not
depends on the
dangerous.
cop who
Yeah,
observed
so
them.
that
Yeah.
yeah, when you have the rigidity, it doesn't make sense in certain circumstances. But when you have the flexibility, you invite bias and you invite mistakes because people come from a place of bias and mistakes. There's a really crazy uh, study about Israeli parole hearings where they found like uh, the most like, the strongest variable in terms of whether or not you get granted parole as a prisoner is, like, where in the schedule you get heard. If you get heard the very first thing in the morning, you're very likely to be granted parole, and if you're the last person they hear before lunch when they're hangry, then you're very unlikely to be granted parole, and stuff like that is, like, crazy to me, so I guess I don't like those sorts of injustices. I don't think like, that's not a good system, I don't think.
So
That
should
something so arbitrary, like somebody's blood sugar is the most important factor in terms of what happens to you in your life.
so yes or no? Are there some situations in which you believe abortion should be legal?
Yes.
Me too. Cool. How well do you get along with non-human animals?
Not super well. I had to, like, really perspective take with them, like, I don't naturally kinda see them as, like, complex living creatures. I have to kind of, like, really be like, "Okay, this is a complex living creature. Let's notice the different complexities that we can notice."
What are your feelings about global warming? Do you think that our laws should be changed to slow down global warming? Do you think it's something we should be prioritizing? Is it something that you personally feel like you care about, or not so much, or anything in there?
So I think unfortunately global warming is like one of these topics that has like a lot of bad data. I haven't like done like a lot of good research to figure out. I'll give you like a quick example. Somebody was like, "Oh, we can tell that there's global warming because this particular glacier has receded so far that you can now see this World War I bunker that we couldn't see for decades." And then a
Yeah.
lot of people in the comments were like, "Does this imply that the glacier was receded at the same level during World War I, like 100 years ago?" And
Mhm.
I think so unfortunately, people are, like, making kind of just stupid arguments, for it when I think it's interesting to note, yeah, that glaciers do recede and, like, they wax and they wane, and I think we can say that without saying that there's not global warming or whatever else. I think the big thing is I think it's 4.9 million people a year die of air pollution. I think that's one thing that is probably more important than global warming, but like fixing that probably would help global warming as most people understand global warming to be. So I'm usually like one of these type of things like, oh, we disagree about this. Is there something else that we can agree on? Okay, air pollution kills like crazy amounts of people. And so let's clean up the air.
I've got two more questions for you.
Uh-huh.
Um, and just so you know, I'm happy to discuss any of this stuff. I'm just trying to keep timing in mind based on what
Yeah,
you
you
said.
did great. Yeah, I'm having fun.
Yeah, me too. I like your answers a lot. Let me pick my two best questions. What do you think about the utility of war? Do you think war is ever the answer?
It's kind of funny. I just thought about this as you're asking these questions. Is there like a little structured into a kind of a dichotomy? And I keep answering them being like, third option, or whatever. And that probably is my preference is to fight against what I perceive even as a dichotomy. And I wonder if it's like somebody's trying to force me into thinking that it's this or that. And I'm like, no, I really don't want to even have like the framing of the question affect my answer. Maybe that's again like the lawyer in me because I know like leading questions are like trying to put words in your mouth and like all these kind of different things. I'm not saying you're doing that. I'd like everybody ask question and the form of the question is like, but like if you were doing a survey or something, you'd have to go through and be like, is the form of the question going to affect people's responses? And it always does.
Of
But
course.
now I've
So what's
forgotten
your
your
opinion of
question.
war and its utility?
I would say that war is necessary to enforce certain basic rights. Like, I would not get in a physical fight with somebody unless it had to do with my personhood and the violation of my personhood. And then I think that's such a higher, um like a higher value thing, like the integrity of somebody's personhood, that's almost always worth doing something to violate somebody else's personhood. So I would say that war in certain things, situations in which somebody is trying to violate the personhood of others, then I would say no, they can't. Like we can't tolerate that, even if it means like dying, even if it means violating their personhood by killing them. I think that's warranted.
Okay. Do you think that that answer, let's say I asked you this like 20 years ago, do you think your answer would be similar, or do you think your feelings about that have changed over time?
Super changed. I used to care 0 about personhood.
Can
I
you say
mean,
more
I
about
probably cared because I think everybody naturally does, and they feel bad when their personhood's violated. I just was not aware that I felt so badly when my personhood was, violated. I just that was not on my radar. I was, like, 0 aware or close to 0 aware of it.
I wonder also if there maybe has been a shift, and please tell me if I'm hearing this wrong, but from like valuing your own personhood to maybe now encompassing more of others, like value in others'
Yes.
personhoods. Would you say that that has changed?
Yeah, and I would say, I even have religious beliefs about this, and I would say it's like the main reason why I'm still religious is because I think this is true. Like the Mormon theology is that there was like a war in heaven, and the war was about people's agency and the right to choose, basically their personhood. Like, could you force people to do something, or could you not force somebody to do something? And they had a war in heaven about it. And I like think, yeah, that is one thing that you should have wars, even if it's like a war in heaven where it's like they can get up to all manner of crazy things. And it's like there's the Mormon belief is that the people who kind of lost the war, who were finally like cast out, they're kind of like damned forever. But it's like, well, we can't have people who think it's okay to interfere with other people's agency, continuing to progress. Like that is the one thing we can't have. And I just find that to resonate so strongly with me. Like, yeah, that is the one thing we can't have. We can't have people doing. And partly I feel, like I think that people develop personality disorders for a lot of different reasons. But I feel like a major reason why I developed my personality disorder is probably because people violated my personhood, and they violated it so frequently, so regularly, and it hurts so much. Either because I was a highly sensitive person or wasn't, or I was normal sensitive, but it hurt so much that I just thought, it's better for me to just detach from my sense of self than to continue to feel these constant assaults on my identity and my personhood.
Last one. I would love to talk more about that one day
Yeah, of course.
if you're open to it.
Absolutely.
I'd love to talk more about any of this. So I always talk too much and ask too many questions. So I moderate like hell. I'm happy to like I would love to chat more someday. But I think the last question this is always my big one. Let's talk for a minute about the human condition. Um,
Mhm.
to you, Emmy, what capabilities do humans have that other animals don't that you think may have contributed to our ecological dominance? And let's just assume for the moment, like I know insects have also taken over a lot of the planet, and there are things that humans don't control, obviously, but the evolutionary successes that humans have enjoyed, what humanness do you think has contributed to that? If you had to pick like one most thing.
So I do think that, kind of like bringing it back to psychopathy and empathy, I do think empathy is an evolutionary advantage as compared to other species. I think that
Are
like
you giving me like the top answer or an answer?
an
I want like
answer.
I want
You
like
want
your
the top
I want the number one thing that you think contributed to human success.
the number one thing that contributed to human success is predicting the future, like causal reasoning.
Tell me more.
So I think like there's so many ways that it manifests itself. So we've been talking about linear thought, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 would be like linear numbers, but too, there's like logarithmic and like natural log or whatever, right? And so
Gross. Yeah.
certain like when we think of like, okay, we're growing 5 apples and then we add twice, that's linear kind of like thinking, right? But if you're throwing a spear at a gazelle in Africa, like prehistoric man, then it's actually like a logarithmic calculation that you're making with the spear throwing. It like goes up and it like kind of like levels off and then it kind of like whatever drop,
Yeah.
that's more. And so if you ask them like if you go to some of these primitive tribes that are still like relatively isolated, they don't kind of count in linearity, like this to this to this isn't like twice as much, it's like 5 times as much because that's what it would be logarithmically.
But what do you make of like birds and butterflies that migrate seasonally, kind of thing? There is evidence of predictability of future and seasonality in other animals.
Yeah, I actually don't know that much about like I do know maybe what that it's like it's not the butterfly that starts the migration that actually ends up at the end. It goes through like 5 generations while they keep doing it. That I don't know, but like the human ability to predict not just that like if I plant this seed it will turn into 5 seeds or if I throw this spear it will end up over there. It's like all these different kind of like causal connections all like they're doing it for migratory purposes, but we're doing it for like a million things. We're able to take that thought and then apply it abstractly to
Sure.
basically almost everything we encounter, I guess is what I mean.
Now compare that ability with empathy. Do you think that that's a more valuable trait?
No, I don't think empathy is more valuable.
Okay.
I think well, in terms of like, yeah, predictability and like causal reasoning is like I think the most empathy is probably not even in the top 20.
Really
Yeah.
interesting. Okay. Because I would have loved to just let you go on it with empathy because I highly value that as far as a part of the human experience. I don't think it's like something that everyone needs to survive by any means, but I do think it contributed strongly to our evolutionary success as a species. Then maybe this is my last question because I'm going to bring it back to empathy. My bias would have easily let you go on, but um, let's bring it back to empathy. What do you think, this will be my last question, how do you value competition and cooperation in human interaction?
So I think and I think being coming from the art world in a way, like in music, I have a little bit of a different perspective because there's kind of a joke amongst musicians that like we hear something and we say that sounds so disjointed. It sounds like it was composed by a committee, right? Like, oh, that national anthem sounds like it was composed by a committee and or a movie. Like you can watch a movie and be like, it sounds like 20 people had like a different idea about what this movie should be and that's why it ended up kind of like this. So I think in art it's easy to see how collaboration can be a bad thing. And I
Sure.
think a lot of people don't naturally have that thought, collaboration. How could collaboration ever be a bad thing? Yeah, it can. I think it's even the reason why I don't read books right now. I'm sure I will start reading books again, like maybe when I'm like in my 50s or something, and I've stopped having my own ideas or whatever, But to I don't necessarily think that competition is like one human against another. It's more a competition of ideas that I think is valuable. I don't think there's any competition of one human against another. I don't think there's any hierarchy between human value. I don't think just because somebody does something better than you that they're better than you. Or I don't even think that like it means they're more valuable than you or more like better in this situation even. I don't know. Like I don't even go that so far as to say I can say that like it's fine for one person to prefer, one musician over another without necessarily saying anything about their value as a human being. Like I think that there is no hierarchy of human value, I guess. So when I think that there's value in competition, it's not to say that somebody's human worth is competing against somebody else's, because that never happens. I think it's that this idea or this activity or this way of using scarce resources, and time is a scarce resource, right? Your mental energy is a scarce resource, and some of them lead to different outcomes. And sometimes we think that you're going to end up with peanut butter when you do this, and we end up with nothing. We end up with like scorched scorched garbage when we try to do it, right? So I'm a big believer in like, well, you have to kind of just try things and like a scientific method, just try things and see if you're right or not. And like mistakes are are not on a hierarchy of better or worse than non-mistakes. Like a success is not necessarily worth more than a mistake. Uh, I guess it's all kind of down to context. So that's how I feel about collaboration versus competition, I guess, is that even when you look at the results of something, it's really contextual and it's really up to a person. Like I talk all the time about on Twitter for some reason, this is like a major talking point about how we need to have economic growth in order to pull everybody out of poverty. Like worldwide poverty is like a truly disturbing thing to me. That like you have like close to like, I don't know, like 30% of the world lives on less than $1.60 per day. And that just seems crazy to me. That like you have babies who are like have like are not developing correctly. They have rickets because of malnutrition, or they're going to have these health consequences forever for something that's as simple as feeding them. For something that's so cheap that we could definitely do it. And but when I say, hey, we need this growth to pull these people out of poverty, people are like, well, is growth necessarily a good thing? And I'm kind of like, I guess you're right. Maybe the baby should have rickets because is growth a good thing? But I mean, that's what I credit them with that. Like I have my own opinion, but I also allow other people to have an opinion about things. But I do think collaboration creates different results than competition, and sometimes one is better than another, I guess is the short answer.
I would be shocked if you ever stopped having your own ideas. To answer what you said before, I that's my takeaway from everything you've said today. I can't predict the future, but I would place my bets on continuing to observe novelty in what you bring to the table. And
I hope.
I hope too. And I look forward to seeing more of your contributions. And whenever that second book comes out, I will be really excited to read it. I would love to see more of your contributions out there. I think you bring a really unique and helpful perspective. And I've really enjoyed hearing you talk today, talking with you today.
Well, thanks for chatting with me. I've appreciated it. The insightful questions, the pushing back on me, the forcing me to answer the question that I'm avoiding.
Likewise, I appreciate the honesty in your dialogue. Thank you
All right,
so much for your time today.
let do it again sometime soon.
I would love that.
All right. Chat you later.
Chat you later. Ciao.